Today, we are pleased to introduce our speaker, Mica Estrada, who will be talking about her work on the influence of kindness and community in science education. The discussion will be facilitated by Tessa Andrews. And with that, I will pass it over to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're very glad you were able to join us on this Friday to talk with Mica about her exciting work, looking at the relationship between quality mentorship and research experiences on one hand, and student science efficacy, identity, and values on the other hand. LSE Online is this exciting opportunity where we get the privilege of hearing from our colleagues about their own research and the chance to ask them about their research and learn a little more than you can get from reading the paper alone. So I really encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar today. I will be monitoring those and posing them to Mica, and so I'd really love to hear from you. At the end of the hour today, we're going to ask you to provide a little bit of feedback about what you learned. That's really useful as ASCB works to refine this and make it an optimal experience for participants. We'll also ask you for suggestions for future speakers, so have those in the back of your mind and ready for later in the hour. And with that, I would love to invite Mica to get started. She's going to tell us a little bit about her work, and then we'll open the floor to your questions.
All right, so let me share my screen here. So the title that they gave on this was The Influence of Kindness in Community and Science Education, but then I was told that they definitely wanted to highlight a paper that was recently published. And so really the talk is about integration, how people integrate into their professional communities and how quality mentorship and research experience feed into that. So if you haven't read that paper, I'm just going to kind of really quickly go through the key elements of that, and then we'll start answering questions. So this paper that was published was really about the science study, and the science study was an 11-year study that was looking at the efficacy or the impact of the RISE program. It's an NIH-funded program, and when we started this study 11 years ago, we had 1,400 underrepresented minority students. These were all students who had really strong interest in biomedical research careers, and my collaborators on that were Wes Schultz, Paul Hernandez, Anna Woodcock, Victor Rocha. I just wanted to give a nod out to them because they all contributed quite a bit to this research. The participants from this study were drawn from 50 different campuses across the United States. 25 of these campuses had RISE programs and about 25 of them did not, and they were matched according to similarities in terms of the student body. And so we drew all of these students 11 years ago, and then twice a year we surveyed them online on an online survey, and they responded. And our response rate stayed at about 70% or higher throughout the entire 11 years of the study. And we were able to ask a lot of really interesting questions and look at longitudinal impacts from the experiences that they had as undergraduates. And the paper that was published in Life Science Education journal really was about the this model, the tripartite integration model of social influence, which is called TIMSI. And in this model, the idea is that what helps students to continue in a profession is that they integrate into the professional community. And there's three ways in which a person integrates into their community. One is that you can do what the community does. And in this case, it was a measure of scientific self-efficacy. Can a person do what a scientist does? And the theory is that there would be a positive relationship between feeling that you can do it, self-efficacy, and then persisting in science as a sign of what people do when you stay in a profession. You actually stay in it. You continue to go on into it. The second element is science identity, that a person would start to think of themselves as a scientist. So when a group matters to you, you start to feel like you belong to that group, and that's a part of who you are, that's a part of your identity. And that's a second level in which you might integrate into a community. And then the third level is you start to internalize the values of that group. You start to agree deep down that the values of that group are your own values. So to the extent that somebody feels that they can do what the group does, they feel that they identify with that group and that the values are shared values, someone who has all three of those elements would be somebody who's deeply integrated into a group. And so we hypothesized that these three things would predicts staying in STEM. And in the paper that was published, we found that that was true. Even 4 years later, when an undergraduate showed high signs of these things, it predicted them staying in a STEM field 4 years later. So the last thing we did is we ran a structural equation model and looked to see what uniquely predicted. So you have correlations, right? They all correlated with the STEM outcome. But then when you do the structural equation modeling, you're looking to see which one uniquely predicts. You can see from this, I'm not going to go into full detail on it, but what you find is that people who experience quality mentorship at the undergraduate level are more likely to develop the efficacy, identity, and values, but that scientific identity is what predicts staying in STEM or leaving STEM. Likewise, we found that those people who had had at least 2 research experiences as an undergraduate were more likely to develop the efficacy, identity, and values, and that those people, however, that did not uniquely predict the STEM career or not staying in. I will say, though, that one of the reasons why is because identity and values they share similar variants, and so the impact of values was suppressed in the structural equation model. So we have, if you look at the correlations, they're very strong correlations from values to staying in STEM or not, or leaving. But when you do the full model, we had a suppression effect, so you don't see it there. So that's basically what the paper was about. There was a lot more detail in the paper and goes into the measurement and everything, but that gives you a little bit of an orientation so we can start talking about it. I'm really here to answer questions about that you might have about the paper or about the work that I've been doing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Mica. That was an excellent overview of a complex study. I'm wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about how you became interested in studying the persistence of underrepresented minority students in STEM.
Well, I'm Latina, so there was a personal interest. And when I finished my PhD at Harvard, I was pretty worn out, and I actually dropped out of academia for about 10 years, and I stayed home and I raised kids, and I really didn't necessarily think that I was going to go back into academia. So there's a part of me that had curiosity around it just from a personal standpoint, which I think is true for most people. What you study has some kind of personal impact. But the other part of it is that as a PhD student, I was working with Herb Kelman, who had developed that theory, the TIMSY theory, and he had really done much more research on when people comply with orders. He had done work on the My Lai massacre. He was of Jewish descent and was interested in looking at when people comply with orders to hurt people. So that's where that model comes from. It's about compliance. When do you comply with what the group wants you to do or not do? So what happened to me was that I had just read, he wrote a paper on psychological annual review on his theory, and I had read it, and then I went to this meeting that was in Washington, D.C. This is really early when I was just coming back after my 10-year hiatus, and it was about persistence in science. And as I was listening to the research, it really was focused on this idea of efficacy. If people who were minorities just could do the science and felt confident about it, they would continue on. But by the second day of the conference, I left. I was outside the room. I just couldn't take it anymore because I didn't really agree with what they were saying. And outside of the room were 8 other minority PhDs, and we had all left academia. And we started talking. And I realized that the identity and value stuff was really much more of an influencer on why we had left. None of us felt like we couldn't do the science. So I was really just starting off on the science study at that point, and I added some measures in about values, and the identity was already in there, and started tracking it to test my theory, and it turned out that it was true. So
thank you for sharing with that. I really appreciate hearing kind of where ideas start to bubble up and then how you translate those into decades of study. And so thank you for sharing that with us. I'm wondering.
It's ironic. It's actually very ironic that minorities that were at a conference on why minorities leave academia left the room that was discussing that of 50 or 60 people and went outside because we couldn't take the room anymore. So
yeah,
it says something.
It says a lot. It says a lot. So something that you said in there reminded me of your background in social psychology, which you've mentioned before. And I'm wondering if I appreciate within kind of discipline-based education research how people come from really different areas. And I think that's a real strength of the work that we do. And that seems really true in your case. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your background in social psychology influences how you see work in undergraduate STEM.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that drew me to social psychology was how, well, issues of identity and social identity were always of interest to me. My PhD was actually, my thesis was on forgiveness. So I was interested in how people get along, but I was more interested in to what extent are things social as opposed to an individual process. So I was interested, to what extent is forgiveness a social process as opposed to an individual process? And I was interested in that in the context of intergroup relationships. So when you have people who have been at war with each other and they have a peace treaty, then what kind of policies do you put in place so the communities can reconcile and live together? That's where my original interests were. So, but that piece of it of how do we act when we're threatened? And then how do we behave when we can reduce that threat permeates everything I'm doing. Even the stuff in academia now, my work has really moved into this idea of what happens when we don't feel threatened and what happens when we do feel threatened in our academic environment. So stereotype threat, right, is a threat. So I keep coming back to that theme. I'm very interested. I think we underestimate how much we're impacted by other people and by our community and by our social structures. And social psychology provides a mechanism to study the impacts of our social environment that are often invisible and underestimated by the individual. We think of ourselves as acting independently, but really the vast majority of the things that you will do today are impacted by what other people are doing. So I still continue to think that there's power in recognizing how we're influenced by each other and how we influence each other, and that interdependence is key to our satisfaction in our work, in our lives, in our political world. All of that is really important. So I feel like social psychology is a mechanism for helping us to recognize our interconnection to each other, and that's central to changing the way we're dealing with each other in all different levels.
Thank you. I really appreciated hearing about that. So we have questions rolling in now, so I'm going to start passing through some of the questions.
I can see there's things happening.
All right, so I'm going to start with this question, which a few people have brought up. They would like to know a little bit more about how you define a quality mentorship experience.
Yeah, so go to the paper. And I encourage you to go to the paper, open it up, and look and see the questions that we asked, the specific questions that we asked. But the mentor draws on the idea that a good mentor or a quality mentor provides psychosocial support. So they listen to you, you feel like they understand who you are. They provide instrumental support. The instrumental is they give you access to the things that you need to have access to in order to do the science that you're being asked to do. They often provide networking opportunities, professional networking opportunities. And then there's kind of this overall satisfaction that you feel with the person. Mm-hmm. So those components of the psychosocial, instrumental, networking, satisfaction are the components of the quality mentorship measure.
Okay, excellent. So Emma is asking a question about whether you see growth across time in the internalization of scientific values. So she's pointing out that science students may already have a strong interest in pursuing a research career, that they might in fact start with relatively high levels of scientific values. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is something that I find not only in this study, but in several other studies that I've done. When the population of learners that are in their study come into a program where they have a lot of enthusiasm for doing science or STEM career related things. So they come in with identity, and they already have values, and they waver on their efficacy, but they feel some efficacy around what they're doing. What programs often do is they provide a social environment that supports them so they don't lose it. So you particularly see this at freshmen. So when people come in as freshmen and undergraduates, there's a lot of people who have enthusiasm for doing STEM career, but by the end of the first year, you lose huge percentages of underrepresented minority students. They no longer want to pursue STEM by the end of the first year. After going through all those entry classes, they lose enthusiasm. So when we're looking at the efficacy of a program, an intervention program, or looking at the efficacy of a curriculum program or mentorship or any of those things, one of the things you look for is not the growth of these things, but do they maintain them and not lose them? And I don't have any, I've done evaluation and research around several programs that start with students who are interested in this at the get-go, and I haven't seen growth on any of them, but what you do see is the ones who stay keep it, and those who leave drop. So keeping a steady line is actually a good thing in this case. It might be different if you're working with K through 12, maybe at junior high level, you might want to see the growth in that interest happening. So there might be a developmental component to this. At some point, you acquire it, and then you just don't want to lose it.
That makes sense. So we have some questions about thinking about how to foster science identity among students, and whether this person put it this way, is a confounding factor about a longitudinal study like this that there is a real or perceived limited accessibility to STEM careers. So do students, I guess my interpretation of that is, do students have is there a perception that there may be limited accessibility, and does that influence whether they develop a science identity?
Well, I can imagine that if you get your degree and you can't get a job in science and you want one, you can't, I mean, there's two different ways to go, right? One is that you start to de-emphasize and de-identify from that professional identity, or you keep it, but you express it in a different way. So you join a science club, but you work by day at the local supermarket. So I think, yes, if you're not in a social environment that's reinforcing that identity, it is possible that it'll be harder to maintain it. But as far as I know, there's no research that's been done on that. So it's really just my musing, but you could look at it. Yes, so
okay,
I don't know. That's about the best I can do. There is no research on that I know of.
Okay. So a few people are interested in the degree to which we might think about how to change systems to better support students. I appreciated it in particular, this articulation of that idea. So this participant said, the integration model you highlight seems to emphasize the flow of values in one direction. To what extent have you looked at or thought about how persistence has been impacted by the extent to which academia sort of adapts to the mentees or the participants in these programs?
Yeah, this is a big one. I get this question a lot, especially when the audiences are underrepresented groups. So the model is really interesting because one way you can think about it is, how do we change students so that then they fit and they adopt the current value system of the biomedical fields, right? So how do we socialize people to exist in the current state? The other way to think about it is, how is the current value system of science non-inclusive and needs to be modified to better represent the diversity of the students who are coming in and the learners that are coming in. And when I look at it from the data point even, we lose a lot of students. And I really don't know that we will ever have retention rates at the level that we want without modifying the value system of the current disciplines. So for instance, students from Latino backgrounds are more likely to have a value of community impacts. They want to know that the science that they're doing will have influence and will positively impact the communities from which they come. So in a classroom or in a mentorship setting or in your science training program, you can emphasize and find ways to show how the science is related to and can benefit community, right? That's changing the value system of science. So science isn't just about finding a truth, but it's finding a truth with a purpose that will then have positive impacts. You can change the curriculum, you can change the mentorship emphases that are happening, I don't know what the word is, what you emphasize in the mentorship relationship, or you can change through the science training program, you might have opportunities for showing how the science connects to community. That's changing the value system or highlighting a different aspect of the value system of science, which has not traditionally been there in a way that really speaks to a more diverse learner. I think we have to do that if we ever really want to broaden participation. And the model doesn't tell you which one is better, but I can tell you that just from, I'm in these rooms a lot, the programs that work do that. They provide some kind of, in the classrooms, from the cures and those kind of things, you see that they're in the citizen science approaches, that all of them are doing things that are changing the emphasis and showing a different value of not just pure, can I find the facts, but find the fact and find it usable and help it to benefit society in some way. When they make that link, they have higher retentions. So I think that there's growing evidence that actually the discipline value systems need to shift if they want to really broaden and retain a diverse learner population.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll have more questions about that we'll bring up later, but a question related to something we talked about earlier came up that I thought would be worth exploring further. So this person asked, what's your prediction for how this model would look, or what the relationship between mentorship and research experiences and students' STEM career choices might look like if the sample were of students earlier in their career, so maybe first or second year students from underrepresented minority groups, rather than the juniors and seniors who are involved in these programs?
Yeah, there is some data coming out on that. I would say look at Paul Hernandez's work. He's got some data that comes out about first year classes. I think a lot of the first year research is looking at curriculum change, much more so than the mentorship and the research training programs. It seems like the research training programs are more likely, especially the NIH funded and NSF funded programs like the REUs, those really do come more like sophomore, junior year. But the curriculum change work, the cures and the fries and all of those kinds of things seem to be more at the freshman early on level. So I would say that research is emerging right now. And there is some that has, and actually this journal is a great journal to go look at. There's quite a few publications, especially having to do with curriculum change, that that's to speak to that. So, but I do think they're developmentally different, because by the time you got to the sophomore, junior years, they really have decided what they want to study. Whereas the freshman year, that's when you're kind of losing it, or they're not sure what they're going to do. So I don't know. So I think that's also Chris Fund has some research, but I don't know if she has anything on freshmen and mentorship. That's a good one. I don't know. I have to think about that one.
Okay, thank you. So a few people are wondering whether the kind of programs that you were investigating might be really beneficial to all students, rather than just the focus of your work on underrepresented minorities. I'm wondering if you have thoughts to share on that.
I often say I don't know anything about white people. I mean, all my work is on underrepresented minorities. I have some data coming out that has majority and minority or historically underrepresented, historically overrepresented groups. I've written some grants that are in that direction going in, because I am curious whether there's differences or similarities in that. But I would say like 99% of my research right now doesn't include a white sample. I have one paper right now actually that I'm writing that did have 50% majority, 50% minority, and it looks at the impacts of social support. These are graduate students at UCSF, and it looked at the impact of social support on development of identity and efficacy, and then looked at persistence rates. And what I found in that was that for minority students, they put more emphasis on like friends and family support, and than did the majority students. Majority students had put a lot of emphasis on mentorship, like networking support from mentors. That was de-emphasized by minorities. But these were graduate students, and that's the only study I have right now that has majority minorities. So there are differences, but it didn't show any difference in the fact that the efficacy and identity were impacting it related to their persistence a year later. We didn't have a value measure in that, so I don't know how that played out. So,
okay, thank you. So one person is asking if you could talk us through a little bit the structural equation model, just to understand the pieces here for those who maybe haven't had quite as much time to spend on the paper so far. I know you had an awesome slide. I wondered if it would be possible just to bring that back up and talk us through it. Not every
yeah,
single,
okay.
I know there's a ton out there, but the big picture.
Yeah, so if you look at, okay, so all those like little half circles between quality mentorship, research experience, and research experience 1 semester, 2 semesters, those numbers are just showing you the relationship, or you can kind of think of it as a correlation, but it's not exactly a correlation, but the relationship of those factors to each other. So you can see from that the quality mentorship wasn't necessarily very uniquely related to the research experience. When you look at, so if you look at quality mentorship, that the arrow up to the intercept for science efficacy, it says 0.31, and it's significant. That means the quality mentorship during the undergraduate career was predicting their overall science efficacy during their undergraduate career. And then all those like little half circles on the other side are really looking at the intercorrelation or the interrelationship of those factors to each other. So what you really want to focus on are the ones that I colored. If you're trying to figure out like if you're developing a program or something, what should you focus on? The quality mentorship building and contributing towards the building of science identity was really critical. And the science identity was the thing that most uniquely predicted staying in STEM or leaving STEM, taking another career. And you can see nothing related to the medical careers. So this is just kind of giving you a sense of like the relationship, what things are predicting what across time. So research experience 1 semester didn't really relate to much uniquely, but the research experience and having at least 2 semesters did. So I don't know if that makes sense. If you don't know structural equation models, really just look at the arrows that are kind of dark. That kind of highlights what the main emphasis were. And you can see that the circles that say the slopes, linear growth slopes, those are looking to see whether or not it related to growth in efficacy or growth in identity. But you can see here that there was no relationship to those things. And that's because of what I said before, that it stayed steady. They didn't necessarily grow.
That's really useful. Thank you. I appreciate the highlighted version and colored version here, which sort of brings attention to the pieces that you really want people to pay attention to compared to a more black and white version. So thank you for walking us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, is that clear? I don't know if it was clear or not. I mean, I guess with structural equation model, the thing to think about is how much variance is being accounted for. That's really what you're looking at. What's explaining the variation in the next variable. Okay. So when it's significant, it means that the engagement and quality mentorship accounts for some of the up and down of the identity. So it accounts for some of the variance in there, explains the variance in a significant way if it has the little stars next to it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then the growth piece, that was, correct me if I'm wrong, that was their growth in the time that they were in the program. So they're
during the undergraduate
senior year. Okay.
Yeah, and because remember that story I told you about going to a conference and talking to people. After that, I added the value measure because the value measure wasn't in there. So we have measurement and values, but we don't have the growth of it as an undergraduate because it wasn't in there the first year and a half of the study. So a lot of the students were already graduating at that point, but so we don't have the growth from undergraduate. We have growth, we can track growth after, but I added that measure after that conference.
Okay. And you told us earlier that there was a lot of relationship between these science values and identity. And
yeah, so if you look at the half circle between science, identity, and values, you see 0.55 star, 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 star. That shows you how high they're related. If you look at that, so Paul tells me, I believe him, that there's suppression happening, and that's what we wrote in the paper, and that's why it doesn't. But we have actually a lot of evidence that values is a huge predictor as well. Mm-hmm. Efficacy is the one, it's a good predictor at really close to the time that you're measuring it, mm-hmm. but it doesn't have that long-term predictive value in the same way that identity and values do. So as people go further in their careers, the identity, whether they feel they belong in this discipline, and whether they inhabit that identity and whether they value what it's doing, become bigger predictors of whether someone chooses to stay in a profession. Mm-hmm. Lots and lots of people leave, not because they can't do it, but because the social environment's hard.
Yes. And so I want to clarify one thing, just to address a question that came up. So you are explaining that you didn't see that linear slope growth because the students were relatively high in science efficacy and science identity when they started taking these surveys in their junior or senior year.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, their intentions to go on was, I think it was like 8 point something. I have it in one of my papers, but it was pretty high. Like their intentions were high when they started. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So really and this is not just true of this group. Many training programs recruit people who have interest in science.
Sure.
So
and then
you might have a different, if it was like a freshman class, maybe you'll see some growth, but mm-hmm. I haven't seen it yet in any of my research. But I look mostly at training programs.
And it sounds like you also expect that then the research experiences and the quality mentorship are keeping those things high throughout those years of their undergraduate career. Whereas if they weren't in those programs, you might actually expect to see some drop off.
Yeah, and actually I have some data that shows that, like if you compare them to students who are like them that aren't in a program, like propensity score matched groups, or you really see a difference. And that research experience is really important. So students who aren't in a program but get research experience, often they look similar to the students who are in the research training programs in the science study that we did. So that research experience component is pretty critical, especially mm-hmm. at the undergraduate level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about science identity. So I was curious about this as well, and someone posed a really lovely question saying that it's evident of the importance of science identity from this work, and whether you could comment a little bit on sort of which aspects of identity you think might be most important, whether that's coming from recognition as a scientist by others, competence in science, performance in science. Oh, I think you're muted, Mica.
Yeah, sorry, I'm muted because there's a big truck coming by the window right now. I'm really sorry. Can you re-ask?
Absolutely,
I was
of course, yes.
And I couldn't quite get everything.
No problem at all. So just thinking about if science identity is really important, and I think your work really supports that idea, do we know more? Can you talk to us more about what might contribute to that science identity, or what parts of that science identity? Is that coming from recognition from the outside, or recognition of oneself, mm-hmm. their competence in science, their performance, the concrete feedback they might get in that way? I think there's a lot of curiosity.
This is a place where a lot of research could be done. Mm-hmm. All of those listening right now who are early career and want to build a career, I think there's a lot of space here for researching and answering that question. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know that we know the answer to that question, and we don't necessarily know specifically what about being part of a training program or research, doing undergraduate research, what specifically about that is key. Mm-hmm. I have a recent paper that was published in Social Issues Policy Review, which was about the influence of kindness and community on broadening participation in STEM. And one of the things I hypothesize in that is that we have put a lot of emphasis on the negative, getting rid of negatives. Let's get rid of stereotype threat. Let's get rid of prejudice and unconscious bias. Let's get rid of, the racism that's implicit or explicit. And there's been this, this huge emphasis on how do we get rid of microaggressions and all these negative things. And my hypothesis is that you can get rid of all of those things, but if you don't actually have positive stuff happening, you still won't get the integration. So part of being a part of a group, whether it be a professional group or a religious group or a sports team or whatever group it is that matters to you, it's not just because they don't give you negative things. It's because they also show you kindness and they affirm you, and there's this kind of positive experience that's really critical to our socialization processes. So part of building a social identity is about experiencing this positive acceptance at some level, and we're wired for that. We are wired for it. When we want to have social relationships that are not threatening, that we feel safe in. We want that in our personal relationships, and ideally we want it in our professional world as well. So if you're operating in an environment where you're feeling unsafe, and that's not good, if you get rid of all of like the negative stuff, that's actually really an ambiguous, weird position to be in. You're in a room, nobody's being mean to you, but nobody's being nice to you either. And so what happens is that we're wired for vigilance. Is this a safe environment? Is this not a safe environment? Is it okay? And if you're in a classroom and you're trying to figure out whether this is a good social environment, a safe social environment for you, and a certain amount of your brain is being used to work on that question, that means you have less brain space for doing the work that's at hand. Mm-hmm. So, and a lot of the research on stereotype threat, really shows that, the cognitive vigilance that happens when you feel that there's threats. What hasn't been done, there hasn't been research on what are the cognitive impacts of being in a socially affirming environment in academic. Mm-hmm. And that's really where my research is kind of going towards right now, is can we better understand the impact of having positive experiences? And I think that programs and classes and mentorship relationships that do have that affirming experience in them, and I've used the word kindness, that we actually experience kindness, we don't feel like we actually are valued, our dignity is valued, that there's something about that is very powerful for us developing our sense of identity. It's easier to identify with something that is not threatening and that actually affirms who you are. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting interconnection, right? So you're kind of going back into the social psychology and these basic need for attachment and need for relationships that are safe. I mean, we've been that way since the get-go as human beings. So why would we think that in academia we don't need that?
So one question that came up that I think is really interesting is, have you done work or just what are your kind of professional thoughts on the role of things like peers, as well as, so the quality mentorship really speaks to interactions probably with faculty and postdocs and maybe graduate students, but what the role for peers at the same level might be in forming a scientific identity.
Yeah. I think that there's emerging work on peer mentorship. A lot of it is very qualitative and small ends. So this is one of the big challenges with a lot of research on training programs and mentorship, is that they're very small programs and they don't have enough people in them to really statistically, quantitatively show the impact. So what I think is happening now at the national level, sometimes there's national programs like the RISE program or the REUs, or some people actually have, mentorship programs, like mentorship training programs like Chris Funds and Angela Myers Winston. they have big programs where they can collect data at lots of different places. The National Research and Mentorship Network also has that. So where they can start to have a big enough N to ask these types of questions. So with peer mentorship, I right now there's the National Institute of Health has put out an RFA for grants to do research on mentorship, and they may be granting quite a few research grants to look at mentorship, and my guess is that some of those will have to do with peer mentorship. And in fact, I put in a proposal, and it does have a peer mentorship component. It's peer mentorship among faculty who teach entry classes in science. So I think that that's coming up. Mm-hmm. But it's a labor-intensive, expensive thing that needs to be studied. So it needs to be well-funded. It's not something that, if you really want to answer the question with a large enough N, you probably have to do it at a national level. Mm-hmm. I do think that there are some nice qualitative small studies where they've interviewed people and you can get that, but that doesn't have the data that would show a huge amount of efficacy. Mm-hmm. In terms of quantitatively show it. So, but again, early career people, there's a lot of opening there for research that needs to be done. And I think it's a scalable type of way to do mentorship. Mm-hmm. And I think it's happening. I think like when people work in labs and stuff, they often are being mentored by their peers. Mm-hmm. When they start graduate school, they're often mentored by peers because the faculty is too busy. So, and then I know that there's intentional like undergraduate programs where they do the peer mentorship. So I think there's a lot of space for that. And a lot of times the mentorship literature has really looked to who's your professor that you're dealing with. They don't look to the postdoc that's in the office or in the lab or older graduate students or all of that, which can have huge, huge influence. So again, place where there's lots of opportunity for research.
So there's definitely some interest in the audience in the what implications your work might have, or what maybe research questions it might raise for thinking about STEM graduate students. So as the students in programs like these RISE programs become graduate students, do you anticipate that there's similar relationships between kind of quality mentorship and persistence in a STEM career or maybe an academic career? There's some questions about that as well.
Well, with the science study, we actually have data that if we analyzed it, we could look at, because we do have it for 11 years. So a chunk of that time they're in graduate school. So it's an answerable question. I had to find time and energy, or somebody in the team would have to find time and energy to go and look at that. I think that I have a study that I've been doing with ACES, which is the American Indian Engineering and Science Society. I think this was, sorry if I got it mixed up. I'm not good with acronyms, but that's mostly graduate students, Native American graduate students. And we've been collecting longitudinal data together to look and see an online mentorship program, what that impacts are. So I think that there's data coming out on that. But I personally am kind of at the point where I'm analyzing it more than I have answers.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I think
look forward to that.
Yeah, I had to ask Paul too what he has going on. I know that Paul told me that the value measure was a strong predictor as people got older. Mm-hmm. Got further on in their programs. So, but yes, and the study that I mentioned before, that was the Bridge program, looking at social support, how that impacts the development of efficacy and identity. That was with graduate students, majority and minority.
Okay. To what extent do you think what you're finding, and I realize we're asking you to speculate at this point, would translate beyond the biomedical sciences to things like physical sciences, computational sciences, mathematical sciences, maybe even the degree to which people form identities who go on to medical school?
Yeah, so the data that we have actually does look at going into medicine or going into a STEM field, and those are very different. So I don't have it here, but those who go into medical, they do start to lose the science their identity as a scientist and their endorsement of the values also drops. So they don't look like the students who stay in STEM in terms of those measures. And I work at UCSF, and I've given the talk with the showing kind of the lines for each one of these groups across time. And you can see, like, you know, the ones who stay are like this, and the other ones are like, they're like medical school students lose it. They lose that idea of themselves as a researcher. So there is that data that we have. In terms of engineering and mathematics, I do have 2 studies that have those elements in it. We have some longitudinal data. I think that we'll find very similar things. I think that those elements of efficacy, identity, and values are true to how we integrate into groups in general. And so if you can figure out what the values are of that group and measure that, and identity, you know, you tweak it so that it's for engineers or for computer scientists or mathematicians. My prediction is that we would find a similar thing, because those things they're important even when they're groups that have nothing to do with our profession. So I've done some work in climate change and use this model to look at leaders and populations' integration into communities that are concerned about climate change, and how much they're engaged in pro-environmental behaviors. How much do those 3 things, efficacy, identity, and values, predict engagement in pro-environmental behaviors? And we find that it does, you know, predict it. So I think the model itself is not just about science. It's a model of when we comply with our group norms and when we don't.
Very interesting. So I'm keen to know, and I know a lot of audience members are too, what recommendations you would have for those of us who are some part of an undergraduate life sciences program, and what, you know, departments or programs that maybe span departments can do to use what you're learning to promote persistence and retention. Yeah,
well, I mean, there's 2 different kinds of like models, right? There's models that account for every single variable. They account for the huge amount of variance for your outcome variable, and they're so confusing and so complicated it's really hard to apply them. So you look at them and you're like, great, but what do I do with that? Then there's models that don't account for all of the variance, but they're simple and you can use them. And the TIMSI model is like that. It doesn't account for everything. I'm sure there's lots of other variables that are important, but it counts for a good amount of variance. And if you can focus on these 3 things, I think you can make a big difference. And most effective classrooms, programs, mentorship relationships have all 3 of these things. And so if you're working in this field, I would say, first of all, see how are you contributing to these already? You know, how do you build efficacy in your classroom, or, you know, how are you helping your students to gain confidence in doing the science or doing the STEM work? How are students socially experiencing your classroom, right? Or how are they feeling? Are they feeling affirmed? Are they feeling like they are a part of the group? Are they feeling alienated? You know, so what are you doing to build that social component so that they can see themselves, envision themselves, and maybe even experience themselves as a scientist? And part of that happens by doing the science, but also there's a social affirmation that is necessary for that. And then the last component, and this is the one that we kind of goes back to the earlier question, is you have a choice on the values one. One is that you try to socialize people into the existing value of the science community, right? Science is important, and knowing facts is important, that type of thing. Or you listen to the values of your students and figure out how to connect the content of your class or your program to the values of the students. And there's different exercises for doing that. There's you can have people write essays about why do you think doing this work is important. Just giving them a moment to reflect on why what they're doing is valuable is found to be a powerful intervention in a classroom. And there's evidence on that. Judith, and her last name is so hard to pronounce. I always want to say Harkiewicz, but I know I'm saying it wrong. But she has research on that, on the impact of having students do kind of this writing exercise in intro classes, and how that increases retention and increases grades actually for students, especially first generation students. So I would say become conscious of what you're doing right, celebrate that, and then think about how do you build on that so that your students are walking out of your program or your classroom with these things intact, and if not stronger than when they came in. It doesn't happen by accident most of the time. And the students who aren't getting it and who need it drop out.
So I'm thinking about my own department, and I don't think it's different from lots of departments, and where we would, as we think about the degree that students get in our department, where we would try to make some of these changes. And I am hearing some really great ideas about what we might do differently in the classroom. And I'm thinking also some of what you said made me think, like, what as a mentor of undergraduate researchers might I do differently? I'm wondering, you've gotten the chance to see lots of different programs, if there are particularly innovative or things you've seen, or you said you've been in the room for a lot of the programs, what you see those programs doing that may go beyond something in a classroom or something I as an individual do, a little more programmatic, that might actually have the potential to change the culture within a department so the faculty do think differently about the values of science. That's a big ask. I'm just curious if you have any particular.
I think this is really where we are right now in the state of this field. We're at the state where we can identify some programs that work really well, and they've become islands within their institutions. And now the next question is, how do you take what we've learned from these islands and actually apply it at the institutional level or in the departmental level? And there's a lot of actually funding going towards that. The National Institute of Health has been funding a diversity program consortium, which is about institutional change, has a strong institutional change component. That includes grants through the National Science Foundation have that kind of component. The HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, has the Inclusive Excellence grants, which also are about taking things that we know work in a small way, and then how do you apply them to really transform the department or whatever. So I'll put on my other hat, which is somebody who taught MBA students in organizational psych for years and years. And one of the key things you want to look at is leverage points, right? What are the points where there's leverage, there's a possibility to do something. So what is the training? What's the mentorship training like in your department? What is the training on cultural sensitivities and values and stuff? Is that happening for faculty? So there's components of, can we do training and help faculty to make a difference? Mm-hmm. There's components of, can we change curriculum so students' experiences are different? Mm-hmm. Can we celebrate what some administrators are doing, best practices and such, so that they become the norm. So the key is we want to shift what's normative practices, right? So that there's social support for doing the right thing. And one of the best ways to do that is not to focus on what we're doing wrong, but to focus on what's working. So it's easy to go to a faculty meeting and sit there and tear everything apart, why everything's going wrong, what's going right, and how do we know it's going right? So there's a paper that was published in CBE. I was the lead author, but there was 15 people on I think 15 people on it. And there were recommendations to institutions for how to broaden participation. And in that, the first thing that we said was keep track. What is your retention rate for your department? How do you know if you're getting better? How do you know when your institution is getting better? You don't know unless you keep track. And we move towards what we measure. So in terms of leverage points, one of the big leverage points that's available to us now that was not available 30, 40 years ago is tracking really simple things. And do students get undergraduate research experiences? what kind is it? Are they doing it in a classroom? Are they doing it outside the classroom? Whatever. Did they get mentorship while they were at the university? What's their ethnicity? What's their gender? What's their generational status? First, second, third generation, whatever. If we had that information for every student in every department that was STEM, and we knew that for the universities, we would know we would know how we're changing, and we would know what's changing it, whether the mentorship is really helping or whether the undergraduate research experiences are helping. So I think that's a huge leverage point, is keeping track of what it is we want to change, measuring it, and knowing when we've done it well or when we haven't done it well. So
thank you